Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our webinar today on COVID-19 vaccines and return to work plans. My name is Simran.Ahuja, and I'm a legal assistant with the Chug LLP New Jersey office. So as COVID-19 vaccines have become more readily available, many employers are wondering how to manage the vaccination process for their employees. Questions like, can employers require their employees to get vaccinated, and should employers provide vaccines to their employees directly, have been asked multiple times in the past few months. Today, our excellent panel will answer these questions and other questions related to returning to work amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. These questions will help employers manage their legal compliance concerns. If at any time throughout the presentation today you have any questions, please enter them into the question and answer chat box, and we'll relay them to the panel at the end of the presentation. Today, we've got a great panel of attorneys to share their knowledge. We have Esther Q, an attorney in our Western Virginia office. We have Sheena Johnson, an attorney based in our Atlanta, Georgia office. We have Prema Rodham, an attorney in our New York office. And we have Human Yavi, an attorney in our Santa Clara, California office. So let's get started with the presentation today. Prema, is it legal for employers to ask whether their employees have been vaccinated?
Thank you so much, Simran, for that awesome introduction. And to your question, yes, absolutely. Not only can employers ask their employees whether they have been vaccinated, they can also require proof of vaccination. However, it's important to remember that when an employee has not been vaccinated and indicates so, the employer must be very careful not to pry as to why, particularly in situations in which vaccinations are voluntary and not required for the job that the employee is doing. Employers should also be cautious not to ask additional information if an employee declines to take a vaccine. Any further questioning could inadvertently lead to a medical inquiry protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. These type of medical inquiries are only permitted where they are necessary for the job, depending on the nature of the employer's business as well. Back to you, Simran.
Okay, Prema. And some employers are considering mandatory vaccination policies. So are such policies legal?
So employers can legally require employees to get vaccinated if they can establish that it's a legitimate job requirement, and the employer can make reasonable accommodations for workers who cannot take the vaccine because of disabilities, medical reasons, religious reasons, etc. The employer needs to reinforce that the vaccine has the ability to stop employees from having severe illness or developing complications from COVID-19, so that it could help the individual from becoming a direct threat to themselves or others in the workplace. So if an employer requires its employees to provide proof that they have received a COVID-19 vaccination from a pharmacy or their own healthcare provider, the employer cannot mandate that the employee provide any other or additional medical information as part of the proof. Back to you, Simran.
And Prema, you mentioned that reasonable accommodations are required under the mandatory vaccination policies. So what are some of these accommodations and what makes them reasonable?
Sure. So as I said earlier, an employer may require its employee to receive the vaccination only if there is no reasonable accommodations available to reduce or eliminate the risk of COVID-19 that does not cause an undue hardship for the employer. So if the vaccination requirement would exclude individuals with disabilities or medical conditions, the employer must provide that they cannot make reasonable accommodations, such as reasonable remote work options and policies, providing gloves, masks, requiring to maintain the social distancing guidelines, and other infection control practices. So if an employer can safely eliminate or reduce the significant risk of harm imposed by COVID-19 by adopting these accommodations, then it may not be required to mandate a vaccine. However, if the employer can show that adopting these accommodations would impose an undue hardship on the business, then the employer has no duty to adopt these reasonable accommodations. So the question then becomes, what is undue hardship? It is an action or actions requiring significant or unreasonable difficulty or expense to the employer. There are a number of factors to consider when determining whether reasonable accommodations poses an undue hardship to an employer. Some of these factors are the nature and cost of the accommodations to be provided, the employer's overall financial resources and financial situation, and the employer's type of operation or business. So we have to consider that some employees may have disabilities that prevent them from receiving a COVID-19 vaccine. For example, employees who suffer from immunodeficiency or strong allergies may not be candidates to safely receive the COVID vaccines. So in these instances, the employee may request a reasonable accommodation from receiving the vaccine. So reasonable accommodations, again, as I said, will take the form of remote work options, protective gear, and social distancing and other safety policies. An employer is required to provide these accommodations unless doing so would pose an undue hardship to them. Back to you, Simran.
Okay, and employers who are considering mandatory vaccination policies should also consider how they're going to track these vaccinations. So can you tell us more about tracking policies? Sure.
So depending on the nature and size of the business, employers can consider a mandatory vaccination program. The intention behind a mandatory program is to ensure that the workforce is protected so that companies can resume normal business activities and operations to pre-COVID levels. However, to maintain the integrity of a mandatory vaccination program and ensure its compliance within the company, employers should commit to adopting a comprehensive tracking system. So by having a robust tracking system, employers can monitor the employees who have been vaccinated, the individuals challenging this policy of a mandatory vaccination, the professionals or employees who need accommodations, and any other unique circumstances that need to be addressed within the scope of this mandatory vaccination policy. On the contrary, one may not need to implement a tracking system for a voluntary vaccination program because it becomes ambiguous to ask employees to self-report and leaves a lot of unknown and inconsistency. Undoubtedly, there is also an administrative burden that accompanies any kind of tracking system. However, the benefits outweigh the concerns and should be considered early on as employers look to deploy a mandatory program. Mm-hmm. Back to you, Simran.
And as these employers are considering their mandatory vaccination policies, should they also consider the benefits of a voluntary policies? Maybe you can walk us through the pros and cons of each.
Sure. As I said, some employers are considering mandatory programs based on the nature of their business. The upside of having a vaccination program that's mandatory is that it can bring a lot of benefits to the companies as they look to return to normalcy, including motivating the workforce, expediting the return of employees to a traditional work setting, relaxing COVID-19 specific policies, and eliminating the health concerns in high-risk environments. However, there are several drawbacks to consider this before fully committing to this kind of a program, including that it will require compliance tracking and data management of information provided by employees. Additional challenges are presented if employer is outsourcing the management of this information. There's also limited impact on social distancing protocols as companies will still need to have employees comply with these policies. And there's also an increased need to provide special accommodations to address the challenges that are raised by other programs, laws such as ADA, Title VII, and OSHA, including the risk of providing an uneven application of accommodations that may lead to discrimination claims and the potential for workers' compensation claims relating to adverse reactions to the vaccination. Also, many important questions will need to be addressed as well before considering any mandatory or voluntary policies. Some of them would be, will the vaccination policy be written? How will the employer collect and protect employees' vaccination records? What are the risks to employees, the public, customers, or clients if the employer does not mandate vaccination? Would a voluntary vaccination policy be as effective? Can the employer offer incentives to encourage vaccination rather than make it mandatory? And will employers continue to maintain health and safety measures such as masks, social distancing after the employees are vaccinated as well? And how should these employers handle meet and confer or renegotiating existing agreements or MOUs? All these are considerations that need to be assessed before making a decision. Then this brings us to the question of what happens if many employees refuse to be vaccinated. Employers may be reluctant to discipline or terminate a large number of employees, and equally reluctant to create multiple individual exceptions that may lead to litigation as well. Because this is an untested area of law, employers should consult with legal counsel before considering any corrective action, or maybe even before considering which program to adopt. Now, coming to voluntary programs, while mandatory vaccination requirements may be lawful, employers really need to carefully consider whether requiring a vaccination is truly necessary in their area of business or practice. Many employers are considering a voluntary program over a mandatory program, as hardline approaches to vaccination risks not only lead to legal missteps, but also alienating your workforce. Some employers have started offering incentives such as gift cards, additional paid leave to encourage their workers to get these vaccination shots. Also, with a voluntary program, employees will be less likely to raise retaliation claims or other adverse actions, while employers have more flexibility with the types of information that they can solicit through pre-screen questions in compliance with the laws. On the other hand, with a voluntary program, an employer has less control over their workforce being fully vaccinated, and also the reopening of business safely is up in the air, and implementing future COVID-19 policies such as continuing social distancing, etc., also need to be considered. Employers can have several ways of encouraging employees to voluntarily vaccinate. Some of the ways that they can do it is to have open discussions with employees and management as to the advantages of getting vaccinated, providing credible vaccination information to the employees. As I said earlier, providing certain incentives for employees who get vaccinated, and definitely encouraging leaders in the organization to be vaccine champions. Back to you, Simran.
Thank you, Prema, for your insight on these policies. We'll move on to providing on-site vaccination. So some employers may want to provide vaccines on-site to encourage a higher number of their employees to get vaccinated. Sheena, what should employers consider related to on-site vaccinations? Sheena?
Oh, my apologies. I was muted, but thank you, Simran, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for attending. With respect to your questions, employers may opt to provide vaccines on site to encourage their employees to get vaccinated. Things to consider from the employer standpoint should be availability, cost, as well as state and federal laws associated with on-site vaccinations. With respect to availability, employers should consider whether this benefit will be offered to all employees or just those under the company health coverage, and whether they will extend the program to dependents. With respect to costs, the costs for on-site or near-site programs for vaccinations can become steep. With respect to federal and state laws, there are requirements by the CDC and federal law to register or enroll to provide on-site vaccinations, so that is something to consider as well. With respect to on-site options, options include using existing occupational health clinics, employer-run temporary vaccination clinics, or even mobile vaccination clinics. With respect to laws that employers should consider, they should consider ERISA, which is the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, which will be determined by how involved the employer is in the vaccine program. When employers pay for the provision of medical care to their employees, they're offering group health plan coverage, insured or self-funded, and they create an ERISA-governed welfare benefit plan. Employers considering sponsoring on-site or near-site vaccine programs or using a third party to administer vaccines to employees will have to be mindful of their ERISA plans. While this shouldn't be difficult for employers, they must ensure that everything is in order, including adding the necessary information to the summary plan descriptions and updating the participant counts. In addition, while there may be compliance obligations to bear in mind, ERISA preemption allows employers to not have to worry about some of the state and local laws. It should be noted that employers opting for an incentive program which are not offering to pay or provide the vaccine do not need to create an ERISA plan, which means there are less compliance concerns to be worried about. Other laws that an employer should take into account are the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, under which vaccines are considered preventative medicine, and thus group healthcare plans will be responsible for the entire cost of vaccine administration. Another law to take into account is HIPAA. While employers are generally not subject to HIPAA privacy, security, and breach notification rules, a group health plan usually is. HIPAA defines a health plan to include an employee group health plan. So employers who conduct COVID-19 testing or vaccinations of employees should consider whether their testing program qualifies as a group health plan under ERISA and HIPAA, which would create new privacy, security, and breach notification obligations. So in that case, the responsibility would fall on the employer as a sponsor of the plan, or if selected, a third-party administrator, to ensure that the group health plan, for example, COVID-19 testing and vaccination, is compliant with HIPAA requirements. If an employer is unsure whether they are bound by HIPAA reporting and confidentiality obligations, use a third party, which will store participants' data and help insulate the employer from HIPAA. The last thing that should be considered is taxes. If offering an incentive program, employers should be careful of what is taxable and what is not. For example, time off is taxable while gifts such as water bottles are considered de minimis and are not taxed. Back to you, Simran.
Thank you, Sheena. So you mentioned that employers will need to be cautious when collecting employee data for on-site vaccinations. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, certainly. Employers will have to carefully manage the information that employees provide to verify their vaccination or as part of screening vaccination processes. Due to strict parameters by the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, the GINA, the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and HIPAA, employers will need to be clear about the information that the company is requesting, and they can do so through targeted forms and other means to ensure that employees are providing only the details that are necessary to demonstrate compliance with the overall policy. With the Americans with Disabilities Act, employers must show that screening questions are job-related, consistent with business necessity, and they should be limited in form and fashion to adhere to federal and state laws. For example, under the GINA, employers cannot inquire about an individual's or a family member's genetic information. Employers must also be aware of instances where employees inadvertently provide medical information. Depending on the circumstances, such instances may require employers to maintain a separate set of protocols to comply with HIPAA. The ADA restricts an employer's ability to conduct medical examinations and make inquiries into an employee's disabilities. While administering the vaccine is not a medical examination or a disability-related inquiry, screening questions before the vaccine may be considered medical examinations or disability-related inquiries. Therefore, any questions must be job-related and consistent with business necessity. To be job-related and consistent with business necessity, an employer would need to have a reasonable belief based on objective evidence that an employee who does not answer the pre-screening questions and therefore does not receive a vaccination will pose a direct threat to the health or safety of herself, himself, or others. Because employees who are working in person and are not vaccinated could pose a direct threat, employers may be permitted to ask these employees carefully crafted, legally compliant vaccination screening questions. However, it should be noted that these questions are not permissible to employees who are working remotely. Back to you, Simran.
And Sheena, let's talk about hiring new employees. So how does the employee vaccination status come into play when the employer is making new hire decisions?
Right. When it is necessary for the job, yes, it would be legal for employers to make hiring decisions based on whether applicants have been vaccinated against the virus. However, employers who are screening applicants based even partly on vaccination records must be holding current employees in similar positions to the same standard. Employers have got to establish and prove why the vaccination is a job-related requirement. Employers should also consider ethical issues that arise when requiring vaccinations from employment candidates. For example, it may be the case that a qualified but unvaccinated applicant did not get the vaccine because of a pre-existing condition, a disability, or a religious reason. Thus, adding the vaccination as a hiring parameter should not overshadow equal employment laws. Back to you, Simran.
And I know we spoke about federal law and guidance, but how does state law impact vaccination policies at the employer level?
Right. Briefly about federal law. According to recent federal law with respect to employment guidance, private employers can generally require employees to get vaccinated for COVID-19 as long as they comply with federal employment laws that prohibit discrimination on the basis of religion or disability. That being said, states are handling vaccination requirements from employers differently. Currently across the country, there is state-specific legislation pending that addresses the extent to which employers can mandate COVID-19 vaccinations from their employees. Once law, these state legislative items that are pending will supersede federal guidance on the matter. While some states may allow employers to mandate vaccinations subject to limitations and compliance with federal and state employment and anti-discrimination laws, also at the state level, with the increasing availability of the COVID-19 vaccine, a number of states are beginning to consider passing legislation to prevent employers from mandating vaccinations in order to protect those who refuse vaccinations. That being said, employers need to be aware of the rules in their states, especially in big states such as California, Illinois, and New York, and locations where employers have a large number of employees. Employers should also consider financial repercussions at the employment law level for mandating vaccinations. For example, in California, under applicable wage and hour laws, if vaccines are mandated, the time it takes for an employee to get vaccinated should be treated as compensable work time. Similarly, any costs associated with getting the vaccine would be reimbursable business expense. Back to you, Simran.
Thank you, Sheena. We'll move on to the next part of our presentation, which is workplace safety. So employers are planning on returning their employees to work, and the COVID-19 vaccination is a big component of that process. So Esther, what policies should employers have in place from a legal perspective as they bring their employees back into work?
Thank you, Simran, to include me, and thanks for everyone who listened to this webinar. So it's a really good question because at first the employer has to ensure the health and the safe of the employee when they come back to work. So soothing the fear of employee by communicating with them in a timely manner is very important. So absolutely, we have several tips for the employers to smoothly and the boarding the employee who is coming back to the work. So the first is implementing the employee health screening procedure, such as the temperature screening and also symptom screening. But just be aware, it's not mandatory and it's not required. But however, the federal law and the state law is always recommending that as the tip. And the second part is exposure response plan. So for the exposure response plan, which means that the employer need to think of what if the employer is exposed to the coronavirus and what reaction of the employer should take. So in that case, the plan should address different type of issues, including the isolation, containment, and contact tracking procedure to make sure that the employee who contacted with will be also protected. And also for the stay-at-home requirements, let us say, for example, like 2-week isolations, and also exposure communication to the affected staff. So which means that a good communication is required between the employer and the employee. So to make sure that the employee meanwhile be protected and also his privacy also be protected. So complying with the law. The third part will be the personal protective equipment. I think a lot of employer has already implemented that part. So which means that because in order to keep the working environment safe and make sure the employee can feel safety when they are working. So basically the employer should provide the equipment like masks, gloves, and hand sanitizer for them to be protected by themselves. The fourth part can be the plan for cleaning and providing the supplies. So I think this part will be very straightforward. I'm not going to spend a lot of time to explain how to do the cleaning plan. And the other part we will make sure is implementing workforce vaccination strategy. So because a lot of employer is afraid that what if the employee doesn't want to take the vaccination, as Sheena and Prima mentioned previously. So a smart strategy also can be one important part when we want to make sure the employment place will be safe. So in that case, the survey that the intention and the attitude towards the vaccination of the employees can be very important, and develop a voluntary vaccination policy or give some bonus to the employee who is willing to take the vaccination also can be a very smart option for the employer to make sure everybody can be protected. And the last part as a tip I would like to mention is the OSHA obligation. Because for the OSHA obligation, it also involves the record keeping and reporting obligations. So basically, the employer also need to identify the position with the potential for occupation exposure to the coronavirus. And we are recommending our employer to review the OSHA regulation in a timely manner from time to time to determine the work-related of illness so that the employee can be protected very well. Thank you. Give it back to you, Simran.
Thank you, Esther. So what are some of the best practices employers can implement when they're returning their employees to work?
Sure, I highly appreciate that question because I think it's very practical. Basically, we always want to try to avoid returning on one day at the same time, because everybody should aware that can be very overwhelming and also can be possibly unsafe for everyone. So basically, we will recommend the phasing in a return to work. So which means we can categorize the employee from departments to departments, to categorize them from the priority, so whose job attribute will be highly need the meeting with the clients in person. So that's kind of employee can be can return to the office as the first group, or we can do like a percentage, like 20% employee can return within the first week, first month, and the second month will be 40%, and just gradually return will be a more comprehensive plan for the employer. Of course, we also will need to have a plan for the high-risk employees. So of course, as I mentioned previously, it depends on the attribute of a position. So if employee, let us say for the bank, banking person who has to meet the clients daily, so they're highly exposed and have the high risk. So in that case, the employer should have the plan for them specifically, and also the policy customized for their attribute of the position. And for the last part, determining how to handle employees who cannot or do not want to return. I think Prima and Sheena has mentioned that in a very comprehensive way. But of course, the first step the employer has to figure out is the reason why they are not able to return. There can be the employees who are just a fear of returning to work, and also can be the returning who have employees who have family obligation, so that they are interfered to come back to work. And of course, there are also some other employees who remain under quarantine due to the exposure to COVID-19. So the first step is very important for employer to figure out who should be doing accordingly. Thank you. Revert to you, Simran.
Okay, and let's talk about the employee benefits plan compliance. So we know that employers should make sure they don't miss any updates that are needed for their employee benefits plans. So Esther, could you walk us through some plan considerations for employers?
Sure, thank you so much. It's a really broad question, but we will try our best to give a very brief introduction and brief thoughts on it. So whether employees remain on the employer's benefits plan or not, certain notice or action always should be taken and may be required to stay compliant. So let us say the communication, this change to employees are very important, because the employees should be aware of the change and also need to be notified as soon as possible. So there are several compliance that I would like to mention a little bit. The first one is group health insurance. So the employer need to check the eligibility, redetermine the waiting period issues due to the leave or reinstatement, and also need to review any revised eligibility requirements because of the layoff, furlough, and also further determine if those change will be revoked or when. And the second part will be flexible spending accounts. As we all know, the flexible spending accounts, they are not taxable. So the employer needs to address the new flexible spending accounts elections and also allowable change with the employees. The 401k is also a very big part for the employers to consider. So for the 401k, I believe the employer need to check review the eligibility issues due to the layoff or furlough. Of course, it depends on the procedure and the decision internally, and consider any breaking service issues or counting years of service concerns, and also need to review any in-service loans that the employee may take or will want to take. So also, including the eligibility and a payback procedure. So the last point that we want to mention is about the paid leave, because as we all know, due to the special period, the paid leave is a very important part considered by both employers and employees. So the employer should consider reviewing required leave under state or local laws, and ensure employees understand the eligibility requirements. So again, the communication is very important, and determine if there will be company PTO policy change, because as we all know that the company policy always depends on the ability, capability of companies from time to time. So that's the reason that if there's any change, definitely need to be notified to the employees, and also due to the increasing or decreasing paid leave benefits or additional restriction in using paid leave, they need to be notified to the employees. And also the employer need to understand the coordination of leave benefits and communicate these kind of issues to employees as needed. So I think these are the practical tips that we can give it to you. So thank you. Revert to you, Simran.
And in addition to the plans you've mentioned, Esther, we know that the employee compensation plans may have also evolved during the pandemic. So what should employers consider related to compensation as they return to work, as their employees return to work?
Sure, thank you so much. Many employers may have like a compensation change, as Simran just mentioned, or need to make them in order to reopen. So it also depends on the strategy, a business strategy decided by the employer. But of course, as to the compensation consideration, there are several things that need to be addressed and included. So let us say how the employer will handle any missed annual pay increases, right? And if those will be applied retroactively, I think this can be considered by the employer. Will any pay cuts be made or revoked? And understand how to reduce the salary for exempt employees if necessary. And of course, they need to decide and determine if employee status need to be changed, because due to the need of the business, some employees can change the status from exempt to non-exempt, or from full-time to part-time status. These are all needed to be considered as to reopen or reboarding the employees. And of course, for the bonus, which employees really pay attention to, for the bonus, the employer also need to pay attention for how the bonus will be affected, including the eligibility or continuation. So we always recommend, as a practical tip, the employer can have a seminar or a meeting with the employee to discuss about the change. The last one, I believe, is not applicable to most of the business, because there's some business that will be definitely pay attention to hazard pay. So the hazard pay always means additional pay for performing hazardous duty or work involving physical hardship. So of course, for the hazard pay, the employer also need to think, but also depends on their business needs. Thank you so much. River, back to you.
All right, Esther, my last question for you. We know remote work has become a necessity during this pandemic, and while employees are enjoying it as well, many employers are seeing long-term benefits beyond COVID-19. So what tips do you have to employers related to this telecommuting?
Sure. I think there are several points that we can think about for the remote working, because obviously, as the typical traditional way, everybody working in office on site, but due to this special situation, a lot of people start thinking of remote working. So in that case, of course, the employment policy will be changed. Right, and also for the working hours, probably can be flexible a little bit, specifically customized to the employees and also employers' requirements. So we need to consider all the needs of business, whether a pro and con, and to consider whether we really want to continue to allow the remote work or not. So as a practical tip, for example, for the IT area industry, probably they see more benefits for working remotely, so that the policy need to be customized accordingly. But for the marketing team, which needs people to face to face, so probably it's not the best way. But of course, that depends on the determination of the employers. But this is just the several parts that employee can think of. And also for that, employer also need to think of the work schedule, as I just mentioned. And of course, if you work from home, the technology support need to be provided to the employee who is working from home to make sure that the working is efficiently done. The last part is also considered the long-term saving of permanent remote working. So from legal perspective, of course, if it's good for the business, I don't see a lot of restriction for the remote working. But of course, for the remote working, then there's something can be very sensitive. Like Sheena said, if you work remotely, then there's some requirements asking the employee to report their medical issues or reporting the exposure probably cannot be applicable to that case because it's not necessary, as Sheena mentioned. So this kind of parts that we need to consider when we make the decision that we will allow employees to work remotely. Thank you, Simran. Give it back to you.
Thank you, Esther, for your insights. We'll move on to communications planning. So as our previous speakers have established that communication is key when dealing with COVID-19 related issues. So Human, what are some communications that companies should have prepared as they return to work?
Hi, Simran. Thank you, everybody, for attending. So as companies start preparing to return to work, as you said, communication is obviously something we learned is incredibly important. Some of the communications that companies may want to consider implementing if they haven't already, or modifying if they already have some forms of standardized communications, are policies that cover items such as working from home, staying at home when you're sick, physical distancing. Employers may also want to revisit their policies on new training protocols for safety precautions and for protocols regarding disinfection of the workplace. And then the employer may also want to consider whether they want to implement an exposure response communication. That's something that a lot of companies already have, especially companies that had essential workers coming into their place of business during the pandemic. So now with non-essential workers returning to the offices or place of work, there's still always a risk of exposure. So having exposure response communications is always a good idea. And then lastly, employers may also want to have some form of return to work communication that details the employer's plans to get everybody back to the office, if that is their plan, or if the plan is to have some form of hybrid solution where part of the office returns back to the office, part of the company returns back to the office, and some employers continue to work remotely. It still may be valuable to have standardized communications detailing that plan. Back to you, Simran.
Okay. And what about new hire paperwork? We know that new hire paperwork should be reviewed well in advance of returning to work. So what documents need to be updated?
Right. So for new hires, employers may want to incorporate their new policies into the paperwork. So that could include things like security measures regarding data or hardware for employees, new hires who are going to be working remotely. It may include new workplace safety measures that for employees who are going to be working on site. So there is there's a lot of new issues that have come up that were not anticipated in the past, and if any of those are applicable to an employer, they may want to include those in the new hire paperwork. Now, there's always there are some companies that are rehiring employees that they may be laid off or furloughed because of for financial reasons during the pandemic. So for those folks, they may want to have some new documents with those rehired employees. But at a high level, they also need to notify the state unemployment agencies about rehiring employees or furloughed employees. And that's the case regardless of whether they actually hire the recalled employee or not. So if you recall an employee, they decide, you know what, I actually don't want to work for you, you still need to report that to the state unemployment agency. And then lastly, for employees that are on H-1s or other visas, the company needs to address I-9 issues. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole host of regulations over the. Anyways, long story short, for I-9s, please consult an attorney to figure out what you need to do to get ready for those. Back to you, Simran.
All right. So we also know that employers should consider updating their policies that have been impacted by the pandemic. So do you, what are some policies that may need an update, and what changes may be needed to these policies?
Right. So, so a lot has changed. Obviously, you want to make sure that your policy, even regardless of what's going on with the pandemic, make sure that your policy is always in compliance with the paid leave rules and for your state, as well as FMLA time off requirements. But in addition to that, employers may also want to adjust attendance policies for changes in work styles and for potential issues like contaminations at the work site. So that's those are some of the policies you might want to take a look at. Companies may also want to look at flexible scheduling options for their employees, allowing for things like compressed work weeks or flexible start and stop times. And then there's also some new strategies with regards to meal and rest breaks to enable staggered meal rest breaks so that employers can encourage physical distancing. So if that's something that an employer is doing at their work site, they may want to update their policy on meal and rest breaks. Obviously, travel has been hugely impacted, and a lot of companies are not doing travel or only doing essential travel. So the companies may want to sit down and have a real discussion about what is essential travel. Do we continue to send people to conferences, or do we just send them for, the highly important needs? Telecommuting policies, obviously, really important for a lot of tech companies. And with that comes a lot of issues like security, data processing requirements, and safe handling of things like company proprietary information. And then lastly, information technology policies, again, same thing. It's you just want to make sure that if you're allowing folks to work either remotely or on-site, that regardless of where they're working, that your company's IP is protected, that if you're a data-heavy company, that when your employees are taking data off-site, that they're not violating some data privacy regulations. Again, reach out to an attorney if you need any help with any of this stuff. Back to you, Simran.
Thank you, Human. So for the last leg of our presentation about business continuity planning, so what should businesses consider related to their business continuity planning, and how do they go about that?
Well, so first thing they may want to consider is actually implementing a business continuity plan. I think a lot of companies were surprised about the pandemic and were caught off guard in February and March 2020. So there was a lot of frustration, disorganization, and chaos back then. If you had a business continuity plan back then, I think that maybe that's something that helped for some companies. Obviously, hindsight is 2020, so all we can do now is learn from what happened in that moment and see if a business continuity plan is a good fit for companies now. Business continuity plans should address things like what could happen if there is another mass social issue like quarantines across the world. We don't know. A business continuity plan may want to look at what's going to happen financially and in the market over the next 3 to 4 years. Again, we don't know what's going to happen. So it's nice to have one. It's nice to keep it updated, have a task force that monitors what's going on externally in the world, and keeping a close eye on things like rules and regulations.
All right. Thank you, Human, and thank you, Esther, Sheena, and Prema, for all your insights. So this brings us to the end of our presentation for today, but we still have time for a question and answer session. So if you do have any questions, please enter them into the chat box and I can relay them to our panel. While we wait for the questions to come in, Esther, can you elaborate on whether employees have the right to ask to work remotely, and can the company say no to that?
Sure. Again, well, I think employee always has the right to say, I want to work. So they have the right to express what they want. But of course, the employer is not mandatory to say, yes, because that also depends on the business need. The only principle here is, the legal compliance, which means that the employer has the obligation to keep the safe and the health of the employees. So once that step is done, I think the employer has the right and obligation to protect it, protect the employees. But meanwhile, they also need and has the right to make the decision whether it allows to promote or remote work or not. So to make it very short, I think employer has the right to say no.
Okay. Thank you, Esther. So while we still, I don't see any questions here. So maybe Sheena, maybe you can tell us how will an employer know which option between offering on-site vaccinations or promoting off-site vaccinations is better suited for a business and its employees?
Hey, Simran, thanks for that question. To recap earlier, we talked about on-site options being using existing occupational health clinics, employer-run temporary vaccination clinics, or mobile vaccination clinics, which would come to the employer's site or near site. So that would be a good option if you have a lot of on-site workers with predictable schedules where you can set up such a mobile or temporary clinic. If you are also able to enroll with your jurisdiction's immunization program as a vaccination provider, which would involve training staff or engaging an enrolled vaccination provider, that would be a good option for you as well to do it on site. Also, if you have sufficient space on site to set up a clinic while maintaining social distancing guidelines from the screening stage to the post-vaccination observation stage, then it would be a good option for you to do it on site. Off-site resources include community resources. That usually means temporary or mobile vaccination clinics, or going to pharmacies enrolled in the federal retail pharmacy program, or going to hospitals or private healthcare providers' offices, or locating federally qualified health centers and other community clinics. Off-site vaccinations would be a good option if you're a small to mid-sized operation and you have a lot of workers with varying schedules, and you also have a lot of remote workers. You may also have workers who simply prefer using a community vaccination resource rather than an on-site resource for privacy purposes or for personal reasons. So if that's the case, then off-site would be a better option for you. It's also worth noting that regardless of what option an employer does choose, to encourage more widespread vaccinations, President Biden has recently announced a paid leave tax credit to employers who provide full pay for any employee who takes time off to get a COVID-19 vaccination. The tax credit is available to organizations with fewer than 500 employees, and it also provides full pay for employees who take time to recover from the vaccination. The credit covers up to $511 per day for each vaccinated employee, and it's funded by the American Rescue Plan. So that's also worthwhile to note.
All right. Thank you, Sheena. Do we have any questions from the audience? Prima, maybe you could walk us through some tips for a successful voluntary vaccination program for an employer.
Sure, Simran, thank you so much. So because of the limitations, risks, expenses, and high compliance requirements for a mandatory vaccination program, a voluntary vaccination program is being adopted by most employers who are in industries that do not require their employees to be vaccinated. Some of the ways of having a successful voluntary vaccination program, or in making it a success, is educating employees and managers on the importance of vaccination and its effects, educating employees on the vaccines available, and providing credible information about the specific vaccines is also important. Employers can provide opportunities for discussion and encourage open communication with management with regards to employees' concerns and questions about the vaccines and its requirements. This goes a long way, as we've heard from all of our panelists today, as to how important communication is. Having incentive programs in place for employees who get vaccinated has worked for some employers. Some employers have implemented a gift card program, additional time off, or incentives in terms of PTOs. So all these can be creative ways of providing incentives to have employees consider getting vaccinated. Another important thing to remember is flexibility for the employees to get their vaccinations during the workday. For example, giving them the time off during work if that is the time that they could get vaccinated. And also ensuring that the reasonable accommodations are always offered to all employees who do not wish to be vaccinated for any reason. And this will prevent any claims of discrimination or violation of other laws. Again, as we have discussed before, reasonable accommodation examples are flexible remote work policies, gloves, masks, sanitizers are made available in the office premises, social distancing protocols are followed, and such practices and are also posted so that everyone is aware of them. And other infection control practices can also be enforced. So these are some of the tips. Simran, back to you.
Thank you, Prema, for these very helpful tips. If we don't have any more questions from the audience, we can conclude the presentation. All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. For any further questions or to schedule a consultation, please send us an email at info@chug.com or email one of our presenters directly using the contact information on the screen. We do have live webinars each month and other COVID-19 related resources for small and mid-sized businesses. Please visit our website at www.chug.com to register for an upcoming webinar. We also recommend subscribing to our YouTube channel, which is Chug LLP, for great new business content each week. Thank you so much to our panel and our audience for joining our webinar today. We hope this was helpful, and we wish you a happy and safe week ahead. Thank you, everyone.